Welcome, dear listener, to the Sleeping Hourglass. Tonight, as you settle beneath your blanket, we will listen for a family's song. Notes carried across oceans and years, woven of love, of courage, of faith. The Von Trapps, whose voices once rose against silence, remind us that even in the darkest hours, a melody can become a lantern. This story is not of stages and bright lights, not of musicals or movie screens, but of flesh and blood, of laughter and loss, of a household where discipline met harmony and where music became freedom itself. And if you find comfort here, if this little hourglass of rest feels like a place you'd like to return to, you are welcome to linger, to subscribe, to keep this gentle corner alive, but only if it feels right. Here, there is no pressure. The story of the Von Trapps does not begin with a song. It begins with silence, the kind that settles over a life shaped by the sea. Georg Ludwig Ritter von Trapp, the man who would one day be known as the father of a singing family, was not born into music but into the steady discipline of duty. His voice carried not melodies, but the commands of a naval officer, crisp and unbending. He came into the world in 1880 in the port city of Zara, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now called Zadar in Croatia. It was a place of shifting tides and empires where the salt of the Adriatic clung to every breath. His father, August von Trapp, served as an officer in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. His mother, Hedwig, carried noble lineage. From birth, Georg was wrapped in a world where service to the empire was both inheritance and expectation. The boy grew up listening to the crash of waves against stone, the creak of masts in the harbour, and the measured footsteps of men in uniform. The sea whispered promises of freedom and adventure, but it also demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and silence. In Georg's childhood, the empire's reach stretched across Central Europe, its navy patrolling waters from the Dalmatian coast to the distant corners of the Adriatic. To serve was to belong, and belonging was everything. He entered the Imperial Naval Academy at Fiume as young cadet. There, discipline became the rhythm of his days. Early rising study drills, long marches, endless hours of learning the science of navigation and the art of command. The academy trained boys to become officers, shaping them into pillars of obedience and authority. Georg thrived in this world. He was not a dreamer. He was a man of precision, of order. The sea rewarded such qualities. By the turn of the century, Georg had risen quickly through the ranks. He commanded submarines, vessels still new and daring, machines that required nerves of steel and a heart unflinching in the face of uncertainty. Submarines were dangerous, their lives measured in breaths of oxygen and the constant threat of collapse beneath the waves. But Georg embraced the challenge, becoming one of the empire's most respected officers. When war came in 1914, the Adriatic trembled with gunfire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, vast but fragile, was swept into the Great War. Georg von Trapp found himself at the helm of submarines hunting enemy ships, navigating the narrow straits and deep waters with precision. His skill earned him medals, recognition, and a reputation for courage. But war is not only about victories, it is also about loss. Each torpedo fired carried with it not only the destruction of ships, but the lives of men. Beneath the honor of his decorations lay the weight of conscience, an unspoken burden that hardened him. The war ended not in triumph, but in the collapse of the empire he had sworn to serve. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy dissolved, its navy dismantled, For Georg, loyal to the crown and the sea, it was as if the ground itself had disappeared beneath his feet. What becomes of a man when the world he has built his life upon vanishes? Georg, once a commander with a future mapped out in naval charts, was left adrift. There was no longer an empire to serve, no flag to salute, no fleet to command. The silence that followed the war was heavier than the silence of the sea. Yet life, in its quiet persistence, offered another kind of belonging. In the years just before the empire's collapse, Georg had married Agathe Whitehead, the granddaughter of Robert Whitehead, the British engineer who invented the torpedo. Their union was a blend of nobility and innovation, of tradition and modern invention. Agathe was radiant, gentle, and warm, a woman who softened the sternness of a naval man. She filled the von Trapp household with laughter and light, surrounding Georg with a kind of music that had nothing to do with instruments or scores. Together, they welcomed children, 7 in all, who filled their home with footsteps and voices. For a time, life seemed whole. Though the empire fell, Georg had found a new kind of anchor in family. But the sea is not the only force capable of sudden storms. In 1922, Agathe fell ill with scarlet fever, a sickness that spread quickly and cruelly. Within days she was gone, leaving Georg with 7 children and a silence deeper than any he had known at sea. The naval officer who had weathered battles and watched empires crumble now faced the most intimate of losses. The house in Agen near Salzburg, where the family lived, became orderly but hollow. A place where discipline replaced laughter. Georg, unable to bear the sound of music that reminded him of Agathe, forbade it. The children lived in quiet, their father's grief unspoken but ever present. Thus, the man remembered by the world as a father of song began his journey surrounded by silence. It was the silence of mourning, the silence of a broken empire, the silence of a man who had lost his compass. He was both commander and castaway, father and widower, disciplined and wounded. Yet in that silence something waited. A space unfilled, a pause before the next note. For silence, though heavy, is never final. It is the shadow that makes music glow brighter when it finally arrives. The children grew in this muted household, carrying within them both the sternness of their father and the longing for something more. The sea had shaped Georg's voice, war had tempered his heart, and loss had carved silence into his days. But history was not finished with him. In the quiet of that Salzburg home, the stage was set for a new arrival, one who would carry with her a voice bright enough to pierce through grief, and a spirit restless enough to awaken the stillness. The captain of the sea, once master of submarines and silence, was about to meet music again, though not in the way he expected. The silence of the sea had shaped him. The silence of loss had hardened him. But silence cannot last forever. Before Maria ever stepped across the threshold of the von Trapp home, there was Agathe. She is often remembered as a shadow, a name whispered in passing, eclipsed by the brighter fame of the years that came after. But for Georg von Trapp, and for the children who would later sing across continents, she was the first song, the melody that softened the edges of a man carved by the sea. Agathe Gobertina Whitehead was born into privilege, yet her spirit was marked by kindness rather than pride. She carried in her veins the legacy of her grandfather, Robert Whitehead, the English engineer whose invention of the torpedo had altered the very face of naval warfare. It was an invention that tied her life to Georg's before she ever met him. For the torpedo was the weapon that made submarine command a cornerstone of naval strategy. But where Georg's world was one of steel hulls, charts, and commands, Agathe's was one of drawing rooms, gardens, and music drifting from parlours. The two met in a world still bound by empire, a time when Austria-Hungary seemed unshakable. It was a gathering of families, nobles, and naval officers where their paths first crossed. Georg, reserved and disciplined, carried himself with the formality of an officer. Agathe, with her bright eyes and gentle laugh, carried herself with warmth that seemed to melt the stiffness of the room. For Georg, who had known the silence of strict academies and the roar of the sea, her presence was something unexpected, like hearing a violin thread its way into a room otherwise filled with marching drums. Their courtship unfolded not in grand displays, but in quiet moments. Shared glances, conversations that lingered, the subtle weaving together of two lives from different worlds. Agathe saw beyond the stern naval officer to the man beneath, loyal, strong, but also searching for something he could not yet name. In her presence, his voice softened. In her company, his silences grew lighter, less burdened. She became the first harmony to his disciplined melody. They married in 1911, in a ceremony that reflected both tradition and quiet joy. For Georg, the sea had always been home, but Agathe created another kind of harbour, one not found on maps or charts. Their first years together were filled with children, laughter, and the steady rhythm of family life. Agathe's warmth suffused the household, balancing the order Georg imposed with a gentleness that made the walls ring not with silence but with life. In those years, the von Trapp home became a place of love's ordinary miracles. The cry of newborns, the patter of small feet, the laughter of a mother who bent down to gather her children close. Agathe sang to them, not as a performance, but as a mother's instinct, lullabies, folk tunes, small melodies carried on the air like birdsong. Her voice, tender and untrained, was enough to weave a sense of belonging. For Georg, hardened by the disciplines of the Navy, this music was not unwelcome. He watched his children gather around their mother, their small voices echoing hers. Though he remained a man of structure, the harshness of his commands was tempered by Agathe's presence. Where he provided stability, she provided joy. Together, they created a household that carried both strength and tenderness. A balance fragile but beautiful. But history, ever restless, moved around them. The First World War erupted, and Georg returned to the sea. While he commanded submarines, Agathe remained the heart of the home, raising the children through uncertainty and fear. Letters passed between them, carrying news, longing, and hope. Even in the darkest days of war, her words were a steady light for him, a reminder of what waited beyond the battlefield. When the war ended and the empire dissolved, Georg returned to a world that no longer resembled the one he had left. The navy was gone, the empire fractured, and the loyalty he had carried for so long had no flag to rest upon. Yet within his home, Agathe remained constant, a reminder that life could still be rooted even in the midst of upheaval. Her laughter continued, her children grew, and for a time, peace returned to their walls. It did not last. In 1922, a shadow fell across the von Trapp household. Scarlet fever, that ruthless illness of the early 20th century, entered their lives. It moved swiftly, cutting through the health of the children, and then through Agathe herself. Though doctors were called, prayers whispered, and remedies tried, the fever burned on. Within days, the household that had once echoed with laughter grew hushed, waiting for the sound of recovery that never came. Agathe, gentle and radiant, slipped away, leaving Georg a widower at 42 and 7 children without their mother. The silence that followed was different from any silence Georg had known at sea or in war. It was the silence of absence. The hollow echo left when a voice that once filled a room is stilled forever. In the years that followed, Georg tried to fill the void with discipline. The home grew orderly, precise, governed by routines. The children obeyed, but their world felt diminished. The laughter of their mother no longer danced through corridors. The songs she once sang at bedtime no longer soothed them to sleep. Georg, carrying his grief like an unspoken weight, could not bear to hear music in the house. It reminded him too vividly of Agathe, and so he closed the door on it. Silence, once softened by love, hardened into a rule. The children grew in this silence, shaped by the sternness of their father, but carrying within them memories of their mother's warmth. They remembered her voice, her gentle hands, her laughter echoing like a distant melody. It lived within them, even when the house itself seemed too quiet. Agathe's song had ended, but it lingered as memory, a first note waiting for harmony. Georg, though resolute, carried his grief like a man adrift. The empire was gone, the sea no longer his home, and now even the light of his household had been extinguished. Yet life, in its patience, prepares unexpected turnings. For though Agathe's absence cast a long shadow, the silence she left would not remain forever. Something, or rather, someone, would come to fill it not as replacement, but as continuation. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, the von Trapp home stood in quiet. 7 children lived between memory and discipline. A father wrestled with grief and silence, and within the walls of their house, the first song lingered only as memory, waiting for another voice to awaken it. Agathe's laughter, though silenced, remains like a fading echo in the halls of the von Trapp home, a melody unfinished. Soon, another voice will step across the threshold, carrying with her the promise of music returned. On the outskirts of Salzburg, in the quiet district of Agen, stands a house with tall windows and a roof that seems to watch the mountains beyond. In its walls, once bright with the sound of a mother's voice, silence settles like a heavy curtain. It is the 1920s, and within these rooms leave 7 children, the sons and daughters of Captain Georg von Trapp, now motherless, raised in a home that breathes order more than laughter. The house itself reflects the man who governs it. Its gardens are trimmed neatly, its corridors polished, its rhythm marked by rules. The children rise early, their days structured by expectation, lessons, meals, prayers, bed. Georg, who once commanded submarines, now commands his household with the same voice, steady, clipped, exacting. To him, it is a way to bring stability where grief has carved a hollow. To the children, it feels like living in the shadow of both discipline and absence. The memory of their mother lingers like perfume that refuses to fade. The older children remember her laughter, the way she leaned close when speaking, the way her voice lifted in song. The younger ones hold only fragments, a touch, a smile, the rhythm of her footsteps. Her presence is gone, yet it remains in the air, in the shape of their longing. But longing cannot fill silence, and so the von Trapp home grows quieter, its days marked not by music, but by measured routines. It is not a loveless home. Georg loves his children with the fierce protectiveness of a father who has already lost too much, but he does not know how to express it. He is a man trained to command, not to nurture, and his grief builds walls around him that even his children cannot climb. The children adapt. They walk carefully through the house, knowing which words will earn their father's approval and which will bring his stern correction. They sit properly at the table, their napkins folded neatly, their voices hushed. They play, but often in silence, their games carried out with whispers and small bursts of laughter quickly stifled. The house becomes a place of echoes, of footsteps down the long hallways, of doors closing with finality, of a father's voice rising in commands rather than song. Outside, Salzburg glimmers. The cathedral bells ring, choirs practice, folk tunes spill into the air at festivals. But within the von Trapp home, those sounds remain at a distance, shut out by grief's unspoken decree. Georg cannot bear to hear music within his walls. For music, to him, is memory, and memory brings pain. The children, though they long to sing, obey their father's silence. And yet, silence has its own language. In the evenings, after lessons and meals are finished, the children sometimes gather together, whispering stories or humming so softly it barely stirs the air. They share secrets, not out of rebellion, but out of the need to keep warmth alive. It is as though their mother's memory presses gently on them, urging them not to let silence claim them completely. There are tender moments still. Georg, though stern, cannot always keep his love hidden. He walks with his children through the gardens, teaching them the names of trees, showing them how to care for the roses. He takes them to the mountains, pointing out the ridges he once saw from the deck of a ship, drawing lines between land and sea in their young imaginations. But these moments are fleeting, swallowed quickly by the return of structure, order, and restraint. Visitors notice the contrast. Friends of the family see the children's neatness, their obedience, their precision. But they also see what is missing: the spontaneity, the unguarded laughter, the music that makes a house feel like a home. The von Trapps are admired for their discipline, but pitied for their quiet. As the years pass, the children grow. Rupert, the eldest, steps into the role of caretaker for his younger siblings, balancing study with responsibility. Agathe, named after her mother, holds fragments of memory close, her gentleness echoing the woman they lost. Maria, Werner, Hedwig, Johanna, and Martina each carry their own piece of grief, expressed in different ways. Some through quiet compliance, others through hidden restlessness. Together, they form a circle, close, knit not only by blood, but by the shared experience of loss. The house in Agen becomes both shelter and cage. Its walls keep them safe, but they also keep them enclosed in their father's grief. Outside, Austria shifts uneasily in the years between wars, yet the von Trapp children know little of politics or turmoil. Their world is the house, the garden, the mountains beyond, and the silence that reigns within. But silence, though heavy, is never permanent. It holds within it the possibility of sound, just as winter holds the seed of spring. The von Trapp children, raised in the shadow of order, carry within them a hidden hunger for music, for laughter, for something that will break the stillness. They do not yet know it, but the space left by their mother's absence is waiting to be filled. And history, in its quiet weaving, is preparing the thread. One day, a new figure will arrive at the door. She will not come as a wife, nor as a singer, but as a teacher. She will step across the threshold with a voice untrained but alive, a presence both awkward and radiant. And when she does, the silence that has reigned so long in the Von Trapp home will begin to tremble. Not with fear, but with the first notes of music returning. For now, the house in Agen remains a place of shadows and quiet echoes, its silence unbroken but restless. The gates of the Von Trapp villa in Agen stand tall, wrought iron against the sky, their black bars framing the gravel drive beyond. A visitor arriving here feels the weight of discipline, the solemnity of order. It is not a house that welcomes easily. It is a fortress of routine, a place where silence has long settled like dust upon a bookshelf. But one morning in the late 1920s, a figure comes into view at these gates, carrying with her neither military precision nor worldly ambition. She is dressed in the simple habit of a postulant, a novice who has not yet taken final vows. In her hand is little more than a small satchel, in her heart far more. Uncertainty, curiosity, and an unruly kind of hope. Her name is Maria. She has not come by her own design. Nürnberg Abbey, where she has been living and training in the ways of religious life, has made the decision for her. The sisters, though loving, know her restless energy, her difficulty in keeping to silence, her tendency to burst into song where stillness is required. They decide to send her into the world, not to abandon her, but to teach her the discipline of service, to temper her spirit with responsibility. And so, with hesitant steps, she crosses the threshold of the Von Trapp estate. Inside, the house is large, with rooms that echo even when no one speaks. 7 children move through its halls like ships kept in strict formation, each one bearing the trace of discipline instilled by their father. They line up at the sound of a whistle. They march when called. Their shoes are polished, their postures straight. But their laughter, once free and bright, has grown subdued. Since the passing of their mother, joy has been rationed, measured out in careful portions, often withheld altogether. Maria is led inside. She does not yet know that she is to become more than a governess. She believes she is only a temporary figure in this household, a bridge between silence and order, meant to guide children in their studies, perhaps in their prayers. She does not imagine herself a permanent part of their story, and yet, from the first moment she steps into their lives, something begins to shift. The children study her. They see in her something their house has not known for years. Spontaneity, warmth, a kind of unpredictable light. They test her, of course, as children do. But she meets them not with the rigid severity they expect, but with patience, with laughter, and with an openness that feels both strange and safe. And then there is her voice. It does not creep timidly into the rooms. It pours forth like sunlight breaking through clouds. Maria sings, sometimes without meaning to, and the walls that once echoed with command and silence begin to carry melody. At first the children listen in wonder, caught off guard by the joy of it. Then, slowly, they join her. Their young voices, long restrained, rise with hers, tentative at first, then freer until harmony begins to fill the villa where once only echoes lived. The captain notices. Georg von Trapp has lived his life at sea, his spirit tied to discipline and duty. He carries with him the memory of a wife he loved and lost, and the grief of that loss has shaped him into a man of stern lines and sharp commands. He believes his children need order more than tenderness, structure more than song. Yet Maria, with her untamed melodies, challenges this belief without confrontation, without lectures. She does it simply by being herself, by bringing joy into rooms where joy has been forbidden. At first, he resists. To him, her music feels like intrusion, like disorder creeping into the careful ranks he has set for his household. But even he cannot deny the way his children's faces change when Maria sings with them. Their shoulders, once rigid, loosen. Their eyes brighten. For the first time in years, the house feels less like a barracks and more like a home. Maria herself does not set out to transform anything. She comes to serve, to teach, to obey. Yet the gift of song she carries is not something she can contain. It spills over. It becomes the thread that begins to weave the family back together. Evenings are no longer filled only with silence and the echo of boots in the hallway. Instead, there are voices rising together, hesitant at first, then confident, like a meadow of wildflowers learning to bloom after a long winter. Music, which had once belonged to Agathe, the mother, returns in a new form, carried by this young postulant who does not yet know her place in the world. There is a kind of providence in this, for Maria herself is uncertain about her future. At the Abbey, she has struggled to quiet her restless energy. She wonders whether she truly belongs within cloistered walls, whether her spirit, so drawn to nature and to music, can ever find peace in silence alone. In the von Trapp home, she begins to glimpse another possibility, not in defiance of her faith, but as a different expression of it. Service, she realizes, can take many forms, and sometimes the holiest thing one can do is bring joy where sorrow has taken root. The children, sensing her warmth, begin to trust her. One by one, they lower the defenses they had built under their father's stern gaze. They tell her their secrets, their dreams, their fears. She becomes not only a governess, but a confidante, a source of comfort. Where once there was silence, now there is conversation, laughter and song, and though Maria herself cannot see it yet, the captain, too, is being changed. His heart, closed tightly since the loss of his wife, begins to stir at the sight of his children's joy. Maria does not challenge his authority, but she awakens something in him that had long been buried. The memory of love, the possibility of gentleness. In this way, her arrival is not simply a change of staff. It is the quiet beginning of transformation. The house, once rigid and silent, begins to breathe again. Its rooms carry melody, its halls echo with laughter. What discipline alone could not preserve, music begins to restore. And so, with the arrival of one young woman from Nuremberg Abbey, the von Trapp household turns a page. The silence that once defined it does not vanish completely. Grief has its own lasting shadow, but it is softened, wrapped in harmony, given room to heal. Maria stands at the doorway of this new chapter, unaware of how deeply her presence will shape the family's destiny. For now, she is simply a teacher, a singer, a bringer of joy. Yet the currents of history are already moving beneath her feet. Maria's first songs in the villa are like dawn breaking over a darkened landscape. Gentle at first, then steadily brighter. Yet every dawn also carries the promise of storms, and soon music will have to contend with the world beyond the villa's gates. In the quiet halls of the von Trapp home, silence had long been the ruler. The house stood like a vessel stranded on dry land, its captain stern, its crew uncertain, its sails furled against the winds of joy. Order had filled every corner, polished floors, neatly aligned chairs, voices kept low. steps measured. But beneath the strict rhythm, another current longed to break free. The children, 7 of them, carried songs within them like unopened letters, waiting for someone to read aloud what was written in their hearts. When Maria first arrived, she noticed the silence not only with her ears, but with her whole being. It was a silence heavy, not peaceful. It was the silence of absence, not of serenity. In the children's eyes, she saw restlessness, a desire to be heard, though they did not yet know how to speak that language. And so, with a mixture of daring and tenderness, she began to teach them to sing. It started with a single note. At first, the children were shy, their voices wavering as though afraid the walls themselves might disapprove. They had been taught to stand straight, to march, to obey, but not to let the air within their lungs turn into something as uncontainable as melody. Maria's voice guided them gently, not like a commander drilling soldiers, but like a shepherd coaxing lambs out of hiding. She sang with them, not above them, weaving her tone into theirs until courage replaced hesitation. The songs were simple at first. Folk tunes, old Austrian melodies, songs that felt like they belonged to the soil itself. A few words, an easy rhythm, a playful lilt. Slowly, the children discovered that their voices could rise together, could blend and dance in ways that no command, no discipline could force. They began to smile when they sang, their eyes lighting with the wonder of making something beautiful together. The house, once so rigid, began to change its atmosphere. Music crept into its corners like light through shutters. Hallways that had echoed only with footsteps now carried refrains. Even the garden seemed altered, for when voices lifted beneath its trees, the leaves trembled as though remembering the wind's own music. Georg von Trapp noticed the change, though at first he did not welcome it. His heart, still tender from wounds of loss, guarded itself against such vulnerability. He listened from a distance, standing in doorways, his expression unreadable. For him, music was not an innocent thing. It was a reminder. It carried echoes of his wife, Agathe, whose laughter had once been as bright as a song. Music, to Georg, was dangerous because it could reopen wounds he had spent years trying to close. So he held back, arms folded, posture firm, while Maria led his children into the realms of melody. But resistance, even in so steadfast a man, is fragile when confronted with genuine joy. One evening, as the children sang together on the staircase, their voices trembling but strong, something shifted in him. He watched their faces, not stern, not burdened, but alive with delight. For a moment, he heard not only their voices, but the possibility of healing. His sternness, like an old fortress wall, began to crack. It was not sudden. Softening rarely is. He remained guarded, sometimes leaving the room when Maria gathered them to sing. Yet little by little, his ears betrayed his heart. He lingered near doors, pretending to be occupied with papers, though really listening. And when the youngest child's sweet voice wavered with shyness, he felt a pang. Not of irritation, but of tenderness. Something long buried began to stir, the memory of love expressed not in words but in harmony. Maria sensed this shift, though she never forced it. She understood that music is an invitation, never a demand. She allowed him his distance, trusting that the songs themselves would find him. And they did. One evening, the children sang in the drawing room, their voices rising in a hymn. The melody wound its way up the staircase, curling into Georg's study. He put down his pen, closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he did not resist. He listened, truly listened. The voices carried him back to seas he had once sailed, to the laughter of Agathe, to the warmth of family dinners now gone. They carried him forward too, toward the promise of something not lost, but reborn. In that moment, he wept quietly, though no one saw. The transformation deepened when Georg finally allowed himself to join them. It was accidental at first. A familiar tune rose, one he had known since youth. His lips, almost against his will, shaped the words. His voice, deep and steady, joined the fragile chorus of his children. They turned astonished, their eyes wide. For this was not the stern command of a captain, but the voice of a father reclaiming something forgotten. From then on, he was no longer only a listener. He became a participant in the harmony, his bass grounding their higher notes, his presence binding them together. The house blossomed. Rooms once filled with silence now pulsed with sound. Laughter mingled with song. The children, once cautious in their father's presence, began to approach him more freely. Music bridged what words had failed to heal. And Maria, watching this unfolding, understood that the family was being rewoven. She had not brought something foreign into the house. She had uncovered something that had always been there, waiting beneath layers of grief and discipline. Music had always been their inheritance. It had only needed to be awakened. The von Trapp family began to sing not only within their home, but also among friends, at gatherings, in small circles where voices were received with delight. Their harmonies carried more than notes. They carried the story of loss transformed into unity, of silence turned into song. It was in those moments that Georg, once so resistant, began to smile again, not the guarded smile of politeness, but a true, unburdened smile. His children saw it, cherished it, and returned it with their own joy. In their harmonies, they found not only beauty, but belonging. The entwining of voices was more than music. It was healing stitched into melody, memory softened by harmony. Each note was a thread pulling them closer to one another, weaving them into a fabric strong enough to withstand the storms yet to come. In this, the family discovered a truth as old as time. That music is not merely sound but sanctuary. It is the place where grief and hope can exist together, where voices can rise above silence and say, without words, we are still here, together, alive. And so the Von Trapps, once a house of discipline and silence, became a choir of love. The stern captain and the restless postulant, the 7 children who had carried both sorrow and hope, were now united in something stronger than fear. They were bound by music, music that would one day carry them far beyond Austria, across borders and oceans, into the very heart of freedom. As their voices entwined, harmony replaced silence, and love returned where grief had once lingered. Love does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes as a quiet unfolding, a small shift in the air, a glance that lingers longer than it should. Between Georg von Trapp and Maria, affection grew not in haste, but with the patience of seasons. What began as duty, a young postulant stepping into a household of grief, ripened, slowly, into something more enduring than either of them expected. At first, Maria did not see herself as a wife. Her heart was restless, still tethered to the life she had imagined at Nuremberg Abbey. The rhythms of prayer and silence, the cloister's ordered walls, seemed to hold her future. Yet in the Von Trapp household, she encountered a different calling. It came not in the stillness of stone chapels, but in the laughter of children, in the melodies that rose around the family, and in the steady, wounded gaze of a man who had lost much and yet carried more within him. For Georg, love had been buried with Agathe. He had not sought it again, nor believed it could return. His life, once so full of music and partnership, had hardened into silence and command. But Maria's presence softened what grief had calcified. Her voice, bright and untamed, brought warmth to rooms that had long been cold. She did not replace Agathe. She brought something different. Not memory, but renewal. Slowly, Georg allowed himself to feel again. Their affection deepened through shared moments. Teaching the children together, listening to their voices rise in harmony, watching the household change from a place of order into a place of belonging. Love, once unthinkable, began to seem inevitable. When Georg asked Maria to marry him, it was not with grand declarations or the swelling drama of a romance imagined on a stage. It was quiet, heartfelt, steady. He spoke not as a man intoxicated by fleeting passion, but as one who had found, against expectation, a companion for life. Maria hesitated, torn between two worlds. The abbey still called to her, its silence a refuge, its vows a promise. But she had come to see that love is also a form of calling. One no less holy, one no less demanding. To give herself to Georg and to the children was to serve as fully as she ever could behind convent walls. And so she said yes. The bells of Nürnberg Abbey rang out on the day of their wedding, each toll a thread binding heaven and earth, faith and flesh, silence and song. The city of Salzburg looked on with curiosity, for the von Trapp name was known, and the young woman in white had been seen in the abbey's corridors not long before. But, beyond public intrigue, the day belonged to the family alone. Maria walked through the abbey's archways, her steps measured, her veil floating like a whisper of mist. Georg awaited her with solemn joy, his navel bearing softened by something gentler. The children, dressed neatly, eyes shining, watched with wonder as their world transformed before them. This was not only a marriage, it was the completion of a home. The vows were spoken beneath vaulted ceilings that had heard centuries of prayers. Maria's voice, steady and luminous, joined with Georg's, promising fidelity, love, and trust. When the priest blessed their union, the echo seemed to linger, as though the walls themselves rejoiced in a promise fulfilled. Outside, the bells rang again, cascading across Salzburg. They did not merely announce a wedding, they heralded a new harmony. For the von Trapps, the marriage was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one. The creation of a family remembered not only for its songs, but for its resilience. After the ceremony, the household settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Discipline remained, for Georg was still a man shaped by the sea, by order, by loyalty. But now that discipline was tempered by love. Where once silence had ruled, laughter and song took their place. Where once the children had approached their father with caution, now they approached him with trust. Maria, with her unyielding faith and her irrepressible joy, became the heart of the home. It was a marriage of contrasts, the seasoned naval officer and the spirited postulant, the sternness of command meeting the openness of song. Yet together, they created balance. Georg's gravity grounded Maria's exuberance, while her warmth softened his rigidity. Between them, a harmony was struck that echoed through the children's lives, shaping a household unlike any other. The bells of Salzburg were only the beginning. Their sound carried beyond the abbey into the future. For soon, darker bells would toll in Europe. Bells of warning, bells of invasion, bells that would test every promise they had made that day. But for now, in this moment, the sound was pure. It was the sound of love claiming its place against the silence of grief, of faith binding itself to family, of hope preparing itself to endure. The Von Trapps, now bound not only by blood, but by love, stood at the threshold of a story that would carry them beyond Austria, beyond war, beyond the reach of empire. Their marriage was not only personal, it was prophetic. It prepared them to face the shadows gathering over their homeland with unity, with courage, with song. In the candlelit evenings that followed, Maria and Georg would sit together, listening to the children's voices rise in harmony. The abbey's bells were far behind them, but the memory of their sound lingered. A reminder of promises made, of vows spoken, of a love chosen against the odds. And so, within the quiet hills of Salzburg, before the storm of history broke upon them, the Von Trapps found a moment of peace. It was a peace born of love, and of the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it not as fragments, but as one. The bells had rung, the vows were spoken, and harmony filled the house anew. Yet beyond the walls of their home, shadows lengthened, and soon Austria itself would darken beneath a foreign flag. There are moments in history when shadows fall so gradually that at first they go unnoticed. The change begins like a cloud crossing the sun, a dimming of light that feels temporary, bearable. But then the shadow lingers, thickens, and what once seemed like a passing interruption becomes a new reality. So it was in Austria in 1938, when the slow creep of fear became a sudden eclipse. For years, Salzburg had been a city of beauty and tradition. Its Baroque domes gleamed in the sunlight, its cobbled streets echoed with the footsteps of townspeople and visitors alike. Music floated through its air as naturally as the river Salzach coursed beneath its bridges. Mozart's notes were still celebrated here, as if the city itself could not forget the boy it had raised. But beneath the beauty, unease had been growing. Europe was trembling, and the tremors could not be kept at bay forever. The Anschluss, the joining of Austria to Hitler's Germany, did not come only with speeches and decrees. It came with flags, with boots, with the sound of marching. One day the skyline was Austria's, the next it was pierced with banners of red, white, and black, the swastika looming above familiar streets like a storm that refused to pass. For the people of Salzburg, it was a change both immediate and devastating. Yesterday's homeland was gone, replaced by something unrecognizable. For the Von Trapp family, the shift was felt keenly. Their home, once filled with music and faith, now existed in a land where freedom was shrinking. Georg von Trapp, a man of loyalty and service, who had once given his life to the Austro-Hungarian navy, could not give himself to this new power. He had known the sea's vastness, the kind of freedom that comes from salt air and horizon, and he recognized tyranny when he saw it. In the city, parades began to fill the streets. Bands played triumphant marches, orchestrated to drown out hesitation. Crowds gathered, some cheering with genuine fervor, others clapping with the fear of what silence might cost. For many, resistance was swallowed by resignation. To live was to bend, to bow, to blend into the wave of conformity. But not all could bow. Maria felt the change too. She had lived her life with eyes tuned to the unseen, to faith, to love, to the fragile but enduring threads that bind people together. She saw in the swastika not triumph but blasphemy, a symbol that demanded worship of power rather than of God. And she saw, too, how it threatened to suffocate the music that had only just returned to their home. The children, still young, sensed the change in whispers and warnings. They saw the new banners, the soldiers with rifles at their shoulders. They noticed the tension in their father's face when the radio crackled with announcements. Childhood, once sheltered by song, was now shadowed by the awareness that something dark was pressing in. Salzburg itself grew quieter in subtle ways. Neighbours who once greeted each other with warmth now measured their words, unsure of who might be listening. Conversations turned cautious, eyes turned away. The city's music continued, but its notes were thinner, strained, as if played on strings stretched too tight. Even joy had to be rehearsed carefully for fear of drawing unwanted attention. For the Von Trapps, singing became more than pastime, it became defiance. Their harmonies rose like fragile candles in a windstorm, small flames against the encroaching dark. Yet even as they sang, they knew each note carried a tremor. To sing was to remind themselves of who they were, free souls, bound by love and faith, not by banners or tyrants. Georg stood firm in his silence toward the new order. He would not hang the Nazi flag from his house. Though neighbours were pressured into doing so, he would not salute though soldiers passed. His refusal was not loud, but it was absolute. In a world where compliance was demanded, silence itself became resistance. But silence was dangerous. Rumours carried swiftly in those days, and resistance, however quiet, was noted. To refuse was to risk. Still, Georg could not yield. He had already buried one wife, already sacrificed years of his life to service. He could not bury his conscience as well. The Von Trapp family continued to sing in private, their voices braided together in defiance of despair. Sometimes they sang hymns, voices lifted to heaven in prayers disguised as melody. Sometimes they sang folk songs, small reminders of the Austria that had existed before occupation. And sometimes they sang simply for the children, to keep alive the laughter and innocence that history sought to steal from them. Outside their home, the city was changing. Jewish neighbours began to disappear, first from businesses, then from streets, then from life altogether. Shop windows were smashed, synagogues burned. What had once been community fractured under the weight of fear and persecution. The children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Why could friends no longer come to school? Why did families vanish overnight? Maria tried to shield them, but truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. The children, like all children, were observant. They learned to lower their voices when speaking of the changes, to listen more carefully to the tone of their father's words, to watch the faces of their neighbours for signs of who could be trusted and who could not. Childhood innocence was thinning, stretched by history's harsh hand. The Anschluss was celebrated in the streets with orchestrated grandeur, but in the Von Trapp home it was mourned in silence. They knew that Austria, as they had known it, no longer existed. The hills, the rivers, the churches, these remained, but the spirit of the land had been shackled. And yet, even in that darkness, the Von Trapps sang. Their music became not only comfort but compass. It reminded them of who they were, of where they had come from, of what they could not surrender. Each song was a whisper to the future, a promise that tyranny would not erase their voice. But as the months passed, the shadows pressed closer. Invitations, or rather, demands, began to arrive at their door. Georg was asked to show loyalty, to serve under the Nazi flag. The price of refusal grew heavier with each passing week. The family felt the weight of a choice approaching, a choice that would alter the course of their lives forever, and still, in the evenings, they gathered. In candlelight, in quiet rooms, their voices entwined. Sometimes their songs carried tears, sometimes they carried laughter. Always they carried hope, fragile, flickering, but unextinguished. The world around them darkened, but inside their home, the music glowed like an ember. And perhaps that is why history remembers them. Not only because they fled, not only because they sang on foreign stages, but because in a time when silence was demanded, they chose to sing. The banners had risen, the streets had darkened, and Austria itself seemed to hold its breath. Soon, Georg von Trapp would face a choice that no song could shield him from, a choice of allegiance that would decide the family's future. The bells of Salzburg still toll as they always have, sending their echoes through stone alleys and over the river. But the sound is different now. Their resonance does not summon only prayer or festival. It mingles with marching boots, with shouted slogans, with the growing pressure of a nation forced into obedience. Inside the von Trapp household, there lingers a fragile sanctuary. Music drifts through the halls, soft laughter circles around the dining table, and the children's footsteps on polished floors create rhythms that feel almost like peace. Yet, beyond those walls, Austria is no longer itself. A red flag flaps on familiar facades, its black symbol like a shadow clawing into the heart of the land. For Captain Georg von Trapp, the world outside presses heavily on the one within. His life has always been one of service, of honor, of a duty carried not only in uniform but in spirit. Once he wore the Navy's coat with pride, commanding ships through waters unsettled by war, his compass steady even as empires crumbled. That service had ended with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, leaving him adrift, like a vessel stripped of sails. Yet he had carried with him the dignity of command, the quiet pride of knowing he had served not ambition but his country. Now, that country is gone. It has been swallowed whole, renamed, claimed by a regime that values obedience above conscience. The letter comes with ceremony, delivered not by a messenger of peace but by officials who carry themselves with the sharpness of power. Their uniforms gleam. Their words are courteous, but their eyes watch closely, calculating. They present the captain with an offer, though the word offer carries the weight of compulsion, to join the navy of the Third Reich, to once again command, this time under Hitler's banner. It is, they tell him, an honor, a recognition of his skills, his reputation, his past service. He would be restored to a place of authority, a man of the sea once more. But beneath their praise lies something darker, a test. To accept would mean safety, security, prestige. His family would remain untouched. Their home would stand. Their lives, at least outwardly, would proceed without disruption. To refuse would mean uncertainty, suspicion. Perhaps worse. Maria senses the weight of the moment. She watches Georg as he reads the words, his face steady but grave, his jaw set. She knows his silence is not hesitation, but resolve forming. She knows, too, that this decision is not just about him. It is about all of them. The children, too, though young, understand. They sense that the men at the door carry more than polite words. They sense the stillness in their father, the kind of stillness that precedes storms. Georg places the letter down. His refusal does not come with raised voice or lengthy explanation. He does not argue. He simply says no. No, he will not serve a tyrant. No, he will not pledge himself to a cause that violates his conscience. No, he will not allow his loyalty to be twisted into obedience. It is a quiet defiance, but one that echoes louder than any shout. The officials are not pleased. Their polite masks crack, just slightly, revealing irritation, even threat. They leave with clipped words, but not without leaving behind the sense that this house, this family, is now marked. Silence follows them out. A silence heavy, almost suffocating. Maria looks at Georg, her eyes filled with both admiration and fear. She knows he has done what is right. She also knows what such righteousness costs. For Georg, the decision is absolute. His life has been defined by honor, by the compass of conscience. To betray that now would be to lose himself entirely. He cannot live under a banner that represents cruelty, hatred, and war. Better to risk everything than to accept safety at such a price. But what of the children? What of Maria? The nights that follow are filled with whispers, careful planning, and the sound of doors closing quietly behind them. The family knows they are no longer safe. The invitation to join the Nazi Navy was never truly a choice. It was a demand, a summons to submission. Georg's refusal has made them visible, vulnerable. Around them, Salzburg itself is changing. Friends who once greeted them with warmth now avoid their eyes, fearful of association. Neighbors speak in hushed tones. Some begin to display their loyalty to the new regime openly, hanging the red flag from their windows. Others remain silent, their hearts heavy with dismay, but their voices stilled by fear. The von Trapps, however, cannot blend into silence. Their refusal has drawn a line, and yet, within the home, music does not cease. Perhaps it grows even stronger, more urgent, as if to remind them of what they are fighting to preserve. Their songs, once a pastime, now carry the weight of defiance. Each note a declaration: we will not be swallowed by this darkness. The children sing not only for joy now, but for courage. Maria guides their voices, not as an escape, but as an anchor. Georg listens, sometimes quietly, sometimes joining in, his voice deep and steady. The songs rise into the night air, carrying with them both sorrow and strength. The choice has been made, but its consequences are yet to unfold. Georg knows the sea well. He knows the feeling of a storm on the horizon. The air heavy, the waves restless, the gulls crying warnings. That is what he feels now, even as he stands in the calm of his home. The storm is coming, and it will not spare them. Maria, too, feels it. She gathers the children closer, teaching them not only songs but resilience. She reminds them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Together they prepare, not with weapons or barricades, but with faith, with unity, with an unyielding refusal to surrender their souls. The offer of allegiance was meant to bind them. Instead, it has set them free, though that freedom will come at the cost of leaving everything they know behind. The bells of Salzburg continue to toll. Outside, the swastika waves over the city. Inside, the von Trapps hold fast to their own banner, the invisible, unshakable fabric of conscience. One man's refusal becomes a family's destiny. And in that refusal, in that simple but immovable no, lies the seed of exile. The refusal has been spoken, and the silence it leaves behind is heavy with consequence. The summer air of Salzburg in 1938 carries a weight that the hills seem to understand. The city, usually alive with festivity and the glow of culture, trembles beneath banners it did not choose. The swastika flutters above rooftops and squares where Mozart once walked, a reminder that Austria is no longer its own. Yet in the midst of this new silence of fear, music still insists on being heard. The Salzburg Festival, that ancient gathering of song, drama, and culture, has not ceased. It cannot, not yet. Tradition has a way of lingering even when politics seek to smother it. And so, stages are prepared, musicians gather, and audiences take their seats, though they do so now with a shadow behind their eyes. Among those preparing to sing is a family, the Von Trapps. They are not the largest name in the program, nor the most polished, but there is something about them that sets them apart. Their voices, blending as one, do not come from training alone. They rise from love, from struggle, from a home that has known both silence and laughter. When they step onto the stage, they bring with them not only music but a story stitched into every note. The festival hall is hushed. The audience waits, some with the eager anticipation of music lovers, others with a more political ear. The presence of the Nazi regime is never far away. Officials attend, their gaze as much a measure of loyalty as of performance. To sing in Austria now is no simple matter of art. It is also a declaration of where one's soul belongs. Maria stands with the children, her heart steady though her hands tremble slightly. She remembers the first songs sung in the family's home, how voices once hesitant grew bold under the shelter of joy. She recalls how Georg, once stern, softened when he heard his children's harmony echo through the walls. Now, all of that learning, all of that courage, must carry them through a moment greater than themselves. The first notes rise. They are clear, pure, unbroken. The children's voices interlace like threads of light weaving through shadow. Georg stands apart but present, his silence a different kind of music. The music of conviction. He has already refused what was asked of him. The invitation to serve a regime he cannot honor. His refusal lingers in the air like an unspoken chord, a dissonance that can only resolve in exile. But for tonight, their music is the resolution. The audience listens. Some hear beauty, others hear defiance. A family singing together is a simple thing, yet in these times, simplicity itself is an act of resistance. Their harmonies do not bend to the spirit of the age. They belong to something older, something freer. Every phrase becomes a prayer for Austria, every cadence a farewell whispered through song. The children sing with luminous clarity. Their faces, innocent yet brave, mirror the weight of history pressing upon them. Rupert, the eldest, feels it most keenly. He knows they may never sing here again, never walk these streets as freely as they once did. Yet he also senses that their music is a vessel, carrying with it everything they cannot say aloud. The program continues. Folk songs, sacred hymns, pieces of tradition that tie them to their homeland. Each song is both offering and shield, a way of standing firm without raising a weapon. Music, after all, has always been the language of the soul when words are too dangerous. The hall fills with sound that does not yield to banners or armies. For a moment the audience is lifted beyond fear, beyond politics. Even those who serve the new order cannot entirely silence the truth resonating in these voices. Music reaches where ideology cannot. It stirs what is human, fragile, ungoverned. Maria's eyes move across the hall. catching glimpses of faces softened by melody. She knows, however, that music cannot change what is already unfolding. The Anschluss has bound Austria, and no song can undo its chains. Yet this moment matters. This is their chance to sing not only for themselves but for a homeland slipping away. When the final song ends, the silence that follows is heavy. Applause comes, sincere yet shadowed. Some clap with genuine admiration, others with the polite insistence demanded by presence. But beneath the surface, the truth is clear. This performance has been more than art, it has been testimony. The Von Trapps bow. Their faces are composed, but inside, each one knows the reality. This stage, this applause, this audience, it may all be memory soon. They stand not only as musicians but as witnesses to a closing chapter. The city of Mozart, the city of song, is no longer free, and neither are they. Afterward, as they leave the hall, the night air wraps around them. Salzburg's streets, lit softly by lamps, feel both familiar and estranged. Maria walks beside Georg, sensing the storm beneath his calm exterior. His refusal to serve the Reich, his quiet defiance, has already sealed their path. Tonight's festival performance may well be their last thread connecting them to Austria. The children chatter in hushed tones, still carried by the glow of performance. Yet even they sense the heaviness beneath it. Music has given them wings for an hour, but the ground beneath them is shifting. They walk home as though through a dream, the applause still echoing faintly behind them, mingling with the silence of the streets. In the quiet of their home, Georg looks at his family, Maria, the children, the courage that has grown among them. He knows that the time is near when this house, these walls, this city must be left behind. Tonight's festival has been their farewell, though the word was never spoken. The Salzburg Festival of 1938 becomes not only a performance but a turning point. In history's ledger, it may appear as one among many concerts, but for the Von Trapps, it is something far greater. A last song to a homeland, a declaration of love wrapped in harmony, a refusal to bow dressed in melody. The hills beyond Salzburg still echo with music, but for the Von Trapps, the echo carries a different weight now. They have sung their song for Austria, and soon they must sing their song for the world. The festival ends, but its silence lingers. A silence filled with unspoken farewells. And in that silence, the next step waits, a choice of allegiance where music can no longer shield them, and courage must stand alone. Salzburg sleeps beneath a thin veil of night, but inside one household, no one rests. The Von Trapp home, once filled with laughter and the hum of rehearsals, now breathes with the weight of silence. Bags lie discreetly packed, not overfull, but chosen carefully, as though every garment and keepsake must pass a test of necessity. What can one take when leaving behind not only a house, but a country, a life, a history? The children know only fragments. They feel the tension, the urgency, though their parents shield them from the darkest fears. For them, the night feels like a rehearsal in hushed tones, a performance where the stage is the railway station and the audience is history itself. To miss a cue is unthinkable. To falter could cost everything. Maria moves through the rooms with a quiet steadiness that surprises even herself. She glances once more at the walls, the windows, the view of the mountains that once promised safety. Each corner whispers memory, songs sung, lessons given, evenings shared. But memory cannot be carried in a suitcase. Memory must walk beside them, unseen, like a shadow that knows the way. Georg stands straighter than ever, though his heart bears a weight no discipline can dissolve. He has already refused Hitler's invitation, a command in disguise. To lead the Nazi Navy would be to betray everything he believes, everything he fought for under a flag that no longer exists. His loyalty remains with Austria as it was, not as it has become. And now, because of that refusal, the family's future depends on leaving without a trace. They will not flee across alpine ridges, as the myths and stories later suggest. No desperate climb into snowbound peaks, no chase under moonlight. Their departure will be quieter, more ordinary, yet no less dangerous. They will board a train, their tickets marked as though they are bound only for a simple trip, a holiday, a passing absence. The danger lies in the ordinariness, in being seen as nothing more than travelers, when in truth they are exiles stepping beyond the reach of tyranny. The morning comes slowly, the sky paling as though reluctant to reveal what must unfold. The children are dressed neatly, their faces calm. They carry themselves as they have been taught, with composure, with dignity. Yet beneath their calm lies the unspoken knowledge that this is no ordinary journey. They say little, for words could draw attention. Silence has become their cloak. The streets of Salzburg feel different this morning. The swastika still flutters from windows, a reminder that every eye could belong to authority. Yet the city moves as usual. Bakers open their shops, carts roll over cobblestones, church bells call the hour. Life continues as though nothing has changed, yet for the Von Trapps, everything has. At the station, trains hiss and groan, steel and smoke mingling with the murmur of travellers. Families gather, soldiers patrol, announcements echo beneath the vaulted roof. The Von Trapps walk as one, not too quickly, not too slowly. To hurry would draw suspicion, to hesitate would invite questions. They move like a melody, each step blending into the rhythm of the crowd. Maria holds the younger children close, her heart racing with every glance from a uniform. She remembers the stories whispered among neighbours, of those stopped, questioned, vanished. She knows that one careless movement, one misplaced word, could unravel everything. Yet she also knows that fear must not be visible. Fear is a language easily read by those who seek it. Georg carries himself with the same bearing that once served him at sea. His face is calm, his stride steady. Inside, he feels the clash of tides, loyalty to the land of his birth, grief at leaving it behind, and the determination to protect the family walking beside him. His silence speaks more than words ever could, a vow made not aloud, but in the marrow of his being. The tickets are handed over. The moment hangs like a held breath. A glance from the conductor, a pause, then a nod. The family steps aboard. The train door closes with a sound like finality, a seal pressed onto parchment. Inside the compartment, they sit quietly. The children gaze out of the window, watching the city slide past. The spires, the river, the hills that had once echoed their songs. Their faces remain calm, but their eyes hold questions they cannot ask aloud. Maria squeezes Martina's hand, offering comfort without words. The train gathers speed. Salzburg recedes, the familiar skyline dissolving into countryside. Meadows roll past, villages blur, mountains rise in the distance. Each mile is a thread pulling them farther from home, closer to uncertainty. The rhythm of the wheels becomes like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, reminding them that there is no turning back. Maria thinks of the songs they sang at the Salzburg festival only nights before. How the audience applauded, unaware that the music was already farewell. She wonders if those notes still linger in the hall, if the air remembers the courage carried on melody. Music has always been their refuge, their shield. Now it becomes memory, a tether to what they cannot bring with them. Hours pass. The train crosses borders, the land shifting subtly in dialect, in architecture, in the unseen lines of maps. Each crossing is a trial, papers examined, questions asked, uniforms looming. But fortune walks with them. Their documents are accepted, their presence unchallenged. Perhaps it is discipline, perhaps it is grace, perhaps it is the invisibility of those who do not look back. By evening, they are no longer in Austria. They are in Italy, though the soil beneath them feels unreal, as though they are walking on borrowed ground. They have left behind their homeland, not in a blaze of defiance, but in the quiet cloak of departure. And yet, in its quietness, there is defiance still, to refuse the call of tyranny, to step away when asked to bow, is its own kind of rebellion. The family finds lodging for the night, simple and spare. They speak little, eat what is offered, and let the children rest. Outside, the air smells different, the streets murmur in another tongue. Exile has begun not with a declaration, but with the turning of a key in a locked door they may never open again. Georg sits apart, staring into the shadows. He knows that leaving Austria is not the end of struggle but the beginning. They will need to find refuge, to decide where their music, their faith, their lives can root themselves anew. He feels both the grief of what has been lost and the faint stirring of what might yet be possible. Maria joins him, placing her hand gently in his. They do not speak, for words are too heavy tonight. Instead, they sit together, listening to the silence of exile, a silence filled not only with loss, but with the faint hum of courage. For the children, tomorrow will be another day of travel. For the parents, it will be another day of resolve. Tonight they rest, not knowing fully where the road will lead, only that it must lead forward. Austria lies behind them, not erased but unreachable. Ahead lies uncertainty, Europe in turmoil, borders shifting, safety elusive. Yet within them remains the one thing they carried untouched, their voices. Music will guide them, sustain them, remind them of who they are. They have left much behind, but not their song. The train has carried them beyond Austria, but not yet into belonging. Ahead lies a wandering through Europe, a search for soil where their music can take root again. And so the journey of exiles begins. Exile begins not with certainty, but with drifting. The von Trapps step across the border into Italy, yet the ground feels unsteady, as though belonging cannot be claimed with a single step. They have left Austria behind, but what lies before them is not yet home. Italy greets them with sunlight, with language they do not speak, with food that tastes foreign though comforting. Yet even in the beauty of the landscape, there is disquiet. The air in Europe is restless, stirred by speeches and armies, by lines drawn and erased across maps. They have traded one uncertainty for another. For the children, the journey feels at times like an adventure. Streets are new, faces unfamiliar, the colours of marketplaces dazzling. But beneath the surface, they sense the fragility of their presence. They are visitors who cannot stay, singers who cannot yet find their stage. Each new stop is temporary, like a note that resolves into silence too soon. Maria clings to faith like an anchor. She believes that providence guides each step, even when the path seems unclear. She gathers the children to pray at night, their voices rising in whispered harmony, turning strange hotel rooms into sanctuaries. For them, prayer and song are twin lights, one lifting upward, the other spreading outward. Georg remains watchful. His naval discipline shapes each decision. Where to go, whom to trust, how to guard the family's fragile safety. He knows that Europe trembles on the brink of war. Mussolini's Italy offers no permanence. It is a resting place, not a refuge. He remembers the sea, its shifting tides, its unpredictable storms. Exile feels much the same, a vessel without harbour, floating between shores, and so they wander. Italy first, then across borders, following opportunities that flicker and fade. Their wealth is gone, their estates seized, their possessions reduced to what they can carry. Yet one thing cannot be taken from them: their voices. Music becomes both livelihood and compass, guiding them into halls and churches, into gatherings where their harmonies can be offered. They sing not as polished performers alone, but as a family whose music carries the resonance of survival. Audiences listen, at first curious, then moved. There is something in the Von Trapp's sound that transcends language, a unity that feels rare in a world fracturing under the weight of ideology. Their songs weave threads of peace into rooms heavy with uncertainty. Still, exile is not gentle. Travel wears on the children, the constant shifting of beds and towns blurring the sense of place. Sometimes hunger presses against them, sometimes illness lurks. There are days when hope feels thin, when the question of where they truly belong presses like a stone against the heart. Maria lifts them in these moments with laughter, with song, with stories that turn dislocation into pilgrimage. She teaches them that every hardship can be transformed when offered through music. A folk song learned on the road becomes a memory carried forward. A hymn sung in a borrowed chapel becomes proof that God's presence is not bound to place. The war grows louder around them. Newspapers tell of invasions, of treaties unraveling, of alliances shifting like sand. Borders tighten, suspicion spreads. The Von Trapps walk through this Europe as though on a thin bridge stretched across stormy waters. Every crossing is precarious, every official's gaze is a test. Yet still, they move forward. In each town, they find ways to sing. A festival invites them, a church welcomes them, a gathering listens in awe. Their music is no longer just performance, it is sustenance. Each song carries the unspoken prayer: keep us together, keep us safe, lead us to ground that will hold. Georg feels the weight of his choices more acutely in these months. He has turned his back on wealth, on security, on the safety that collaboration might have offered. Yet, when he hears his children's voices rise in harmony, he knows the choice was right. Better to wander free than to live chained. Better to sing as exiles than to serve in silence. Their wandering stretches on. They pass through countries that open their doors briefly, then close them again. Europe itself feels like a house where every room is restless, where no one knows which wall will crumble next. The family learns to live lightly, to carry little, to expect little, and yet to give much through their music. For the children, resilience takes root quietly. They learn not to fear unfamiliar tongues, not to shrink before new faces. Each performance strengthens them, binding them more tightly to one another. They are a choir, yes, but more than that, they are a family knit by necessity, by love, by the knowledge that home is not a place alone, but the people with whom one sings. Nights are hardest. In borrowed rooms, silence presses heavily once the music fades. Maria lies awake, listening to the breathing of children, the shifting of Georg beside her. She wonders how long they can endure this in between. Yet dawn always comes, and with it, another chance to sing, another chance to take one more step forward. The world narrows into survival, but also widens through music. They sing for strangers who weep without knowing why, for villagers who offer bread and kindness, for dignitaries who marvel at their courage. Each audience, in its own way, becomes a witness to their pilgrimage. Each song plants a seed, reminding them that even in exile, they still carry gifts. In time, whispers reach them, whispers of America, a land across the sea, vast and open, where music might find new soil, where their wandering might finally rest. The idea feels distant, almost dreamlike. But dreams can be anchors too, pulling the weary toward hope. Until then, Europe remains their passage. They walk its roads, cross its borders, sing in its halls. They leave behind no monuments, no estates, no possessions, only echoes. Yet echoes can carry far. Their voices, rising again and again, weave across the continent like a trail of light in gathering darkness. Exile, though harsh, has given them something unexpected. Resilience that no regime could break, unity that no border could dissolve. They are learning, day by day, that home is not always found by returning. Sometimes it is found by carrying what matters most into the unknown. And so the Von Trapps continue. Italy, then France, then the countries beyond. Each step a note, each border a pause, each performance a prayer. They do not yet know where the song will lead, only that it must be sung. The road stretches onward, and the horizon glimmers faintly with a new dream. Beyond Europe's tremors lies the vast Atlantic, and on its far shore, America waits to hear their song. The Atlantic stretches wide, a restless expanse of grey water and salt wind. It is a barrier, a threshold, and for the Von Trapp family, it becomes the final wall between the old world and the new. The ship that carries them rocks gently in the waves, as if the ocean itself is listening to their silence, absorbing their prayers, and bearing witness to their exile. Austria lies behind them, its mountains, its abbeys, its streets filled with marching boots, and ahead is the unknown, America. The journey across the sea is more than geography. It is a crossing of time, of identity, of destiny. The children press their faces against the railings, squinting toward the horizon, trying to imagine what this new land might look like. The older ones carry their questions quietly, knowing the weight in their parents' eyes. Maria steadies them all. She speaks of trust, of faith, of a God who guides them still. Georg gazes long at the water, the stern set of his naval jaw betraying both grief and resolve. He has left behind not just his country but also his profession, his heritage, and the graves of his ancestors. And yet, before him stretches a life not yet written. When at last the skyline of New York rises into view, it is as though the world shifts beneath their feet. The Statue of Liberty, torch aloft, greets them with her solemn face, her silent promise. To the Von Trapps, weary with loss and heavy with uncertainty, she is less a monument and more a mother. Around her gathers the clamour of a city alive with movement, horns, footsteps, shouts in dozens of tongues. For a family from the quiet hills of Salzburg, the cacophony is overwhelming. Yet it is also strangely invigorating. They step onto American soil not as tourists, not as aristocrats, but as exiles, as singers, as wanderers in search of a home. Their clothes are plain, their luggage light. What they carry most is invisible. Their voices, their discipline, their faith, these will be the instruments with which they carve their place in this vast, unfamiliar land. At first, America does not quite know what to make of them. The stages of New York have seen everything: jazz orchestras, vaudeville acts, grand operas. But here arrives a family choir, barefoot children and solemn parents, singing folk songs from a continent now engulfed in flames. Promoters hesitate. Audiences approach with curiosity rather than certainty. Yet when the first concert begins, the doubt fades like mist. Their voices rise, pure, woven, unforced. The harmonies slip through the air with the clarity of mountain streams, carrying not only melody but also memory. The audience, restless at first, grows still. These are not mere performers. They are storytellers of the human heart. Each song is a reminder of fields, of hearths, of lullabies sung by mothers long gone. In their music, America hears both strangeness and familiarity, the echo of the old world and the promise of something enduring. Reviews trickle in, then flow. Critics speak of the Von Trapps' angelic precision, their rare sincerity. What captivates is not only their technical skill, but the quiet dignity with which they perform. Unlike theatrical stars, they carry no glitter, no bravado. Instead, they stand together, a family united by necessity, by love, by exile. Their concert is not spectacle, but testimony. For the Von Trapps themselves, every performance is both gift and challenge. The English language still feels foreign on their tongues, though they begin to adapt, weaving in translations, learning new repertoire. They sing Austrian folk melodies, madrigals, sacred hymns, sounds of their homeland, but they also begin to embrace the songs of America. Negro spirituals, Appalachian ballads, and simple hymns find their way into their concerts, connecting them to the soil on which they now stand. Travel becomes their rhythm. Trains carry them from city to city, small towns and large, where parish halls, community theatres, and concert stages welcome them. They sleep in modest hotels, eat simple meals, and rehearse wherever there is space. Life on the road is wearying, yet it also binds them tighter. Every mile away from Austria becomes another mile deeper into their new identity. The American public, caught between the lingering depression and the rising storm of war abroad, finds something healing in the Von Trapps' presence. They are living proof that beauty survives even when nations fall. In their harmonies is resilience. In their quiet smiles, courage. The newspapers begin to call them not just singers but symbols. And yet, beneath the applause, the ache of exile remains. Each night, after the concert's end, Georg feels the tug of memory, his ship, his uniform, his Austria lost. Maria, though filled with fierce faith, feels the burden of leading not only her children but also her husband through this wilderness of change. The children themselves, adjusting with remarkable grace, carry their own silent questions. Will America ever feel like home? Will they always be wanderers? The world beyond America answers brutally. Europe plunges deeper into war. Letters from relatives carry both comfort and dread. News of Austria's fate is grim. Their homeland is swallowed in the tide of the Reich. The Von Trapps understand, with sobering clarity, that return is impossible. Their voices must not only sustain them, but also speak for those who cannot speak freely anymore. In this awareness, their music deepens. What was once performance becomes prayer. Each note is a plea for mercy, for peace, for endurance. Audiences sense it. though perhaps they cannot name it. They leave concerts not only entertained, but also strangely hushed, as if brushed by something larger than song. Over time, America embraces them fully. They are invited to radio broadcasts, to wider stages. Their reputation grows. Families come to listen not only because of the novelty of a European choir, but because the Von Trapps seem to carry something Americans themselves are beginning to long for. A reminder of rootedness, of unity, of hope that survives loss. Children in the audience whisper to their parents, "Can we sing like them?" Mothers hum their tunes while preparing supper. Soldiers, preparing to go to war, write letters home describing the calm they felt in those harmonies. Without realizing it, the Von Trapps become woven into the fabric of American memory. And yet, fame never quite alters them. They remain simple, steadfast. Georg insists on modesty, Maria on prayer, the children on discipline. What sustains them is not applause but calling. Music is no longer just art, it is survival, testimony, gift. In quiet moments, Maria writes in her journals. She reflects on the mystery of exile, on how a family stripped of its home can still be clothed in grace. She writes of America not as the end of their journey, but as a chapter still unfolding. Georg, in his silence, agrees, though his eyes still wander eastward at dusk. Slowly, the family begins to imagine permanence. Land, perhaps. A place to build, to rest. For though America has welcomed them, they long not only to sing across its towns, but also to plant themselves within its soil. They dream of a home not only for themselves, but for their music, a place where they can both labor and sing. It is a fragile dream, yet one that grows firmer with each passing concert. The applause that once felt foreign begins to feel like belonging. The English words that once stumbled from their lips begin to form prayers of their own. And so, across the expanse of America, the Von Trapps carry their exile like a lantern. Their songs, clear and unbroken, remind a nation of what can be salvaged when the world falls apart. They are more than refugees. They are a living psalm, sung into the ears of a restless country. The applause fades, but the longing for rootedness lingers. The Von Trapps dream not only of singing to America, but of building within it a home of their own. And so, the journey continues, toward Vermont, toward land, toward the promise of planting music in soil that will finally hold them. The long road of exile always bends toward the unknown. For the Von Trapp family, that road wound across Europe, over oceans, through the uncertainty of wartime borders, and finally arrived in a place where silence was broken, not by bombs or proclamations, but by the sigh of wind through pines. Vermont, quiet, unassuming, draped in hills that rose like green shoulders beneath the sky, became the soil where their scattered lives began to take root again. They had left Austria not in fanfare, not in the blaze of heroic escape across mountain ridges, but in silence, with careful steps, hoping not to be noticed. The parting was bitter, though music softened the sorrow. But exile, for all its ache, is not only a story of departure, it is also a story of arrival. When they first set foot in the United States, it was not Vermont that welcomed them. New York's noise pressed in like a tide. Car horns and street vendors, skyscrapers rising like cliffs of steel, the pulse of a city that seemed never to sleep. For a family whose roots were in alpine villages, where evenings ended in stillness and morning bells rose from churches nestled in valleys, New York felt like another exile. It was opportunity, yes, but it was not home. Their songs, however, carried them forward. They sang before audiences curious to hear the exiled Austrian family. They sang in halls where their voices carried like echoes of a world slipping away behind the iron curtain of war. They sang because song was the only inheritance they could carry from Austria without fear of it being stripped from them. And yet, even in song, they searched for rest, for a place that would not merely host them, but shelter them. It was Maria who saw it most clearly, the green hills of Vermont, in photographs, in descriptions from kind strangers, seemed to whisper of Salzburg. The air, she heard, was sharp with mountain breath. The winters were fierce, the summers alive with meadow flowers, the rivers bright and cold. It was a land where they might find a reflection of the world they had lost, and in that reflection, perhaps a kind of healing. And so, in the early 1940s, the von Trapps travelled north, away from the crowded avenues of the city, toward the quiet folds of Vermont. The journey itself felt like a soft exhale after the long tension of escape. The hills rose gently, one after another, as though welcoming them. Barns dotted the valleys. White farmhouses stood with shutters open to the wind. And when they finally looked upon the mountains, not as tall as the Alps, but steadfast, unpretentious, clothed in maple and birch, something stirred in their hearts. Here was a place where song would not tremble with fear. Here was a place where children could run without the shadow of uniforms on the street corners. Here was a place where Georg could breathe, where Maria could pray, where the family could gather without glancing over their shoulders. Vermont was not Austria, but it was freedom. They bought land in Stowe, a quiet town that would become the cradle of their new life. At first, the land was bare, its slopes only potential, its silence wide and waiting. The family's hands, so often busy with instruments and songbooks, turned also to building. The Von Trapp Lodge began as something modest, a home that grew outward, almost like a hymn swelling from a single note into harmony. Visitors would one day come to rest there, to hear the echoes of the family's music, but in those first years it was simply shelter, a sanctuary built plank by plank, stone by stone. The rhythm of their life in Vermont began to form. Mornings were brisk, with frost curling across windows in winter. Summers filled the air with the scent of cut grass and pine. The family sang still, traveling for concerts, their voices carried into towns and cities across America. But always they returned to the hills. The lodge became more than walls. It became a heartbeat, a gathering place, a promise that exile was not only wandering, but also planting. For Georg, the captain who had once sailed seas and commanded men with unyielding precision, Vermont was a different kind of command. He was no longer bound to naval orders, nor to political oaths demanded by foreign powers. His duty now was to his family, to the quiet soil that asked only for care. He walked the hills with measured steps, his heart heavy still from the homeland he had lost, yet softened by the freedom he had preserved for his children. Vermont was not a substitute for Austria. He would never mistake one for the other, but it was a place where his loyalty could rest without compromise. Maria, in contrast, thrived in the new world with a resilience that startled even her. The same energy that once overflowed in the abbey's cloisters now poured into the care of the lodge, into the laughter of children, into the songs that gathered neighbours and strangers alike. Where Georg brought steadiness, Maria brought flame. Vermont gave her space to pour that flame into something enduring. The lodge bore not just their name, but her vision of a home that welcomed, that gave shelter, that carried the essence of Austria in its heart while opening its doors to America. The children, too, grew into Vermont. They learned the contours of the land, the slopes where snow lingered longest, the streams where fish darted like glimmers of silver. They carried their music into barns and town halls, into festivals and gatherings, but also sang beneath the open sky, voices rising like threads of smoke into the clear mountain air. For them, Vermont was not only exile, it was childhood, it was belonging, it was the ground upon which they would build their own stories. Visitors came slowly at first, then more often, drawn by the music of the family and the quiet beauty of the land. Some came to rest at the lodge, others simply to glimpse the family whose story of courage had begun to circulate. They found not a glamorous retreat, but a place of warmth where the walls themselves seemed to hum with melody. The Von Trapps did not keep their refuge to themselves, they shared it, as they had always shared their voices, offering song and shelter in equal measure. Yet even in this new home, echoes of Austria lingered. Photographs hung on the walls. Old folk songs were sung around the hearth. The language of their homeland mingled with English in daily conversation. Exile had not erased who they were. It had carried them into new soil where memory and present could coexist. Vermont was not Austria, but Austria lived within Vermont, in the way the hills reminded them of Salzburg, in the way the snow carried the hush of alpine winters, in the way their hearts could remember without being crushed. And so, a new chapter unfolded, from fear to freedom, from silence to song, from wandering to rest. Vermont became the pause in their long hymn, the place where their voices could rise without trembling. The Von Trapp Lodge was not merely a building, it was a living testimony to survival, to faith, to the stubborn endurance of music in the face of loss. The hills of Vermont embraced them, not as a homeland returned, but as a homeland remade. Yet even as they settled into this refuge, the road still called. The stage, the journey, the songs that carried their witness far beyond their hills. And so we turn to the next part of their story, when music once again became their companion on the road. The hills of Vermont offered rest, but rest did not mean stillness. For the Von Trapps, song was never meant to be confined to one hearth, one lodge, one valley. Their voices had always been bridges, spanning silence, stitching brokenness, carrying memory into places that had forgotten how to listen. And so, even as the snow settled softly around their home in Stowe, the road beckoned. They travelled together, not as exiles now, but as witnesses. Their steps were no longer hurried by fear of pursuit, but guided by the rhythm of invitation. Town by town, city by city, their names spread, and with it the sound of harmonies that felt older than the land they now called home. The Von Trapps were not entertainers in the ordinary sense. They were keepers of memory, carrying songs as one might carry a lamp through the night. Their repertoire widened as the years unfolded. Sacred chants, woven with centuries of devotion, rose in the hush of chapels and in the cavernous acoustics of city halls. Folk songs, bright and earthy, carried laughter and longing in equal measure. Ancient hymns, born in cloisters and whispered through ages of faith, found new ears, new hearts. Each song carried not only sound, but history, a living remembrance of worlds left behind, of villages swallowed by war, of prayers whispered in secret. On stage, Maria often spoke a few words before the music began. Her voice, warm but firm, reminded listeners that what they were about to hear was not mere performance. "These are songs of our homeland," she would say, "songs of faith, songs of family. We offer them to you so that you may remember with us." It was not a plea, but an invitation, an opening of doors. The road was demanding, of course. Hours of travel on winding highways, the endless unpacking and repacking of trunks, the weariness of unfamiliar beds and constant movement. These were burdens they carried. Yet woven through those burdens was the thread of purpose. To sing was to breathe, to travel was to give breath to others. Audiences did not merely applaud. They listened with reverence, with gratitude, as though hearing in the Von Trapp's voices something they had long forgotten in themselves. For the children, the tours became an extension of their education. Geography was not taught from maps, but from landscapes glimpsed through train windows. History was not only in books, but in conversations with strangers whose families bore the scars of war. Music was their constant tutor, binding lessons into memory. Each town, each concert hall, became a chapter in their formation, not only as singers, but as citizens of a world still mending. The family's faith accompanied them like an unseen fellow traveller. Before concerts, they prayed together, quietly, without spectacle, as they had once prayed in Austrian chapels. Their music, too, was a form of prayer. A hymn sung in a crowded auditorium could be as sacred as one sung in a monastery's cloister. Audiences sometimes wept, not from technical brilliance, but from the sheer clarity of devotion carried in the notes. In their harmonies, listeners felt a steadiness that the world itself seemed to lack. It was not uncommon for their concerts to end in silence. Not the silence of disinterest, but the silence of reverence, as though the audience did not wish to break the fragile thread woven between stage and seats. Then, slowly, applause would rise, not thunderous but deep, as if affirming something beyond the music itself. On the road, the Von Trapps discovered that their story, though rooted in Austria, resonated far beyond it. Audiences who had never seen Salzburg, who had never walked beneath Alpine peaks, nonetheless felt the weight of exile, the longing for home, the resilience of faith. Their songs became mirrors in which strangers recognized their own hidden struggles. Maria, ever perceptive, understood this. She often remarked that their family was not unique in suffering displacement. "We sing not only for ourselves," she said, "but for all who have lost and all who must find." Her words were not polished rhetoric, but lived truth. The family knew exile, and in knowing it, they became companions to countless others who had endured the same. The road, then, was not merely physical. It was spiritual, emotional, communal. Each journey carried them deeper into the hearts of those who listened, and each song carved a path through the wilderness of modern uncertainty. There were moments of weariness, of course. Even Maria, with her resilient fire, sometimes felt the strain of endless travel. The children longed at times for stability, for the familiar comfort of Vermont's hills. Georg, older now, grew quiet, conserving his strength. Yet these moments were softened by laughter, by the simple joys of shared meals on the road, by the knowledge that their sacrifices carried meaning. The repertoire itself became a kind of diary of their travels. Sacred chants from the past reminded them of Austria's chapels. Folk tunes of America found their way into their set lists, mingling with their heritage and creating a dialogue between old and new. Seasonal carols, sung in towns dusted with snow, carried the warmth of universality. The road was not only outward, it was inward, an unfolding of who they were becoming as a family, as a choir, as witnesses. Audiences sometimes asked how they managed to remain so united, so harmonious, amid the demands of performance. Maria's answer was always simple: because we are family, because our faith binds us, because we remember. These three threads, family, faith, and memory, were the warp and weft of their life. The road did not unravel them, it wove them more tightly together. As the years passed, the Von Trapp's music became more than entertainment in America. It became a quiet testimony, a counterpoint to the noise of a century defined by war and change. In a world quick to forget, their harmonies urged remembrance. In a world quick to despair, their voices carried hope. Travel, then, was not exile's continuation, but its transformation. Once they had been forced to flee, carrying only what they could. Now, they chose to go forth, carrying more than possessions, carrying witness, carrying song, carrying light. Their story on the road is not merely a sequence of performances, but a meditation on what it means to endure, to sing when silence would be easier, to travel when rest would be more comfortable, to share when grief might tempt one to retreat. In their resilience, they became not only performers, but guides. Gentle reminders that faith, family, and song can outlast even the darkest night. And when they returned to Vermont after long tours, weary but fulfilled, the hills welcomed them back as though no time had passed. The lodge stood steady, its walls carrying the echoes of every song they had carried into the world. Home and road became two parts of the same hymn, verses and refrain, silence and sound, departure and return. The road stretched on, carrying them through towns and hearts alike, but it was never endless, for even the strongest voices can grow tired, and soon silence would visit them once more. A silence shaped not by exile, but by loss. The human heart is both resilient and fragile. It carries oceans, and yet it can be undone by the smallest fracture, the gentlest pause. Georg von Trapp's heart had carried more than most. The weight of empires lost, the grief of a wife buried too young, the courage of resistance, the strain of exile, the quiet strength of a family bound together by love and song. By the time the Vermont mountains cradled his footsteps, his heart had grown weary. It is often said that exile never truly ends. One may find new soil, new shelter, even new joy, but part of the soul remains in the homeland, a ghost at the edge of memory. For Georg, this ghost was Austria, and more specifically, the sea. Though the Vermont hills rose nobly, though the lodge offered warmth, there was no horizon of water, no salt in the air, no deck beneath his feet. He had commanded ships, trusted the pull of tides, felt the endless embrace of the Adriatic. In Vermont, he was landlocked, both in geography and in time. Yet he was not bitter. His life had turned toward love, toward Maria, toward the children whose voices became the music of his latter days. He had chosen exile over compromise, chosen silence over allegiance to tyranny. That choice carried cost, but it also carried dignity. In the quiet hills, he lived not as a defeated officer, but as a father, a husband, a witness of principle. By the 1940s, however, his health began to falter. The world was healing from war, but within Georg the war still lingered. Not in battles fought with weapons, but in the wearing down of spirit and strength. The years of command at sea, the grief of losing Agathe, the strain of carrying his family through exile, all these left their mark. He grew quieter, his voice softer, his step slower. The captain, who once stood with naval precision, now moved with the gentle pace of a man preparing to rest. The children saw it first. His silences stretched longer. His eyes, once sharp as the horizon, seemed more inward, gazing at memories invisible to others. When he listened to their songs, he smiled, not with the bright enthusiasm of youth, but with the deep, quiet gratitude of someone who knew each note was a gift. Music, which once returned to him reluctantly, now became the balm that soothed his weariness. Maria stood beside him with unyielding devotion. She had known him as stern, as strong, as disciplined, the man who once commanded with whistles and strict order. Yet she also knew him as tender, as vulnerable, as deeply human. In Vermont, she became his anchor, guiding the household, tending to his health, carrying forward the fire of life when his own flame flickered low. Her faith did not waver. Where Georg grew quiet, Maria grew strong. The final years of his life were not marked by grand events but by simple rhythms. Family meals at the lodge, walks in the hills when his strength allowed, evenings by the fire, listening to the children sing. Visitors came and went, unaware that the captain's heart was slowing, that his presence was growing more fragile with each passing season. To them, he was still the figure at the center of the von Trapp family, even if his voice was now more echo than command. In 1947, the end came quietly, as though in keeping with the dignity of his life. He passed away in Vermont, surrounded not by oceans but by mountains, not by ships but by children, not by salutes but by prayers. Maria was at his side, her hand in his, her heart holding firm even as his grew still. The children, though broken by grief, carried his memory immediately into song. For them, silence was unbearable. And yet, it was precisely in silence that his presence lingered. The world beyond Vermont took note, but only gently. There were no headlines screaming his name, no national mourning. Georg von Trapp had never sought glory. He had simply lived by principle, guided by loyalty to conscience rather than to power. His death was private, yet profound. A ripple that moved outward through his family, through their music, through the quiet testimony of a life lived with honor. For the family, the loss was both devastating and transformative. Georg had been their anchor, their compass. His absence left a void that no song could fully fill. And yet, paradoxically, his silence became part of their harmony. Every note they sang carried an undertone of his memory. Every concert became not only performance but tribute. The captain's absence did not silence them. It reshaped them. Maria bore the greatest weight. Widowhood was not unfamiliar to her. She had carried loss before, in other forms, but this was a different burden. She was no longer simply mother, singer, or guide. She was now the heart of the family in an entirely new way. The children looked to her for strength, and she did not falter. Her laughter, though tinged with grief, returned. Her faith, though tested, held. She carried Georg forward, not in mourning alone, but in resilience. The Vermont hills bore witness to this transition. The lodge, once the joint vision of husband and wife, now became Maria's stewardship. The mountains stood unchanged, as mountains always do, reminding the family that though human life is brief, love can root itself deeply enough to endure. The captain's grave rested there, in the soil of their chosen home, far from the Adriatic waters he once commanded. It was not Austria, but it was still sacred ground. For those who visited, his presence was felt in the quiet corners, in the way Maria spoke of him, in the way the children sang, in the photographs that still lined the walls. He was absent and yet not absent. Silence itself had become his voice, shaping the music that continued, deepening it with memory. The captain's final rest reminds us that every song carries silence within it. Without rests, without pauses, without the hush that frames sound, music would be chaos. Georg's death became such a pause. Not an end, but a shaping silence. A rest note in the greater hymn of the von Trapp family. His absence was not emptiness. It was the space in which their music found new depth. The captain's silence lingered, deep and steady, shaping the family's song in ways words could never capture. Yet into that silence, Maria's courage would rise, carrying forward not only his memory but his melody. Courage often arrives quietly, unannounced. It does not always look like defiance in the face of danger, nor the grand gestures of history's heroes. Sometimes it takes the form of a woman rising each morning, tending to children, carrying forward a household, holding fast to faith when everything around her has shifted. For Maria von Trapp, courage was not a single act but a daily choice. When Georg passed in 1947, Maria's world contracted into silence. His absence was like a hollowed-out room, a place she could not fill no matter how she tried. Yet, she did not allow grief to harden her. Instead, she transformed loss into resilience. Where the captain had once been the anchor, Maria became the mast, steady against the winds of time. The family needed her, and she knew it. The younger children still leaned on her guidance, their lives shaped by the rhythms of the lodge and the echoes of music. Concert tours required leadership, planning, and energy, tasks that now fell squarely on her shoulders. She became both mother and father, caretaker and director, a presence both nurturing and commanding. Vermont itself became her companion. The mountains stood as quiet sentinels, reminding her that endurance was possible, that even in stillness there was strength. She walked the wooded trails, breathing deeply of pine and cold air, finding in nature the same solace she had once discovered in the Austrian hills. The land did not replace what she lost, but it steadied her, grounding her spirit in the present moment. Her courage showed itself in laughter, too. It surprised the children when, not long after Georg's passing, her laughter returned. At first it was softer, tinged with sorrow, but in time it grew bright again. Maria's laughter became a kind of defiance, not against grief itself, but against despair. It told the children we will live, and in living, we will honor him. At the lodge, she worked tirelessly. The place was not merely a home, but a vision, a retreat where music, faith, and community could flourish. Managing it required practical strength, finances, upkeep, hospitality. Maria learned skills she had never imagined needing. She balanced ledgers, negotiated with suppliers, welcomed guests with warmth. The captain's absence had left her with responsibilities that might have overwhelmed another, but Maria carried them with the same fervor she once brought to song. Music remained her constant companion. Though the children were growing older and beginning to scatter into their own lives, she kept the family's voice alive. Tours continued, though less frequently, and each performance became a living memory of Georg. Audiences heard not only the beauty of harmony, but the undercurrent of loss and resilience. Maria understood that their music was more than entertainment. It was testimony. Each note whispered we endured, we chose love, we carried on. Her faith, tested by exile and deepened by grief, became her wellspring. Prayer was not for her an escape from the world, but a way of stepping more deeply into it. In the chapel she built at the lodge, she poured her heart into hymns and silence alike. Visitors often remarked on the strength that radiated from her, not as force but as light. Her courage, they sensed, was rooted in something eternal, something unshaken by death. The children drew strength from her example. They saw in her a woman who refused to let sorrow define their lives. She did not hide grief from them. She spoke of their father often, told stories of his discipline, his humor, his quiet tenderness, yet she spoke of him in a way that did not trap them in mourning. Instead, she showed them how to weave memory into life, how to carry the past without being consumed by it. In time, the von Trapp children began to pursue their own paths, marriages, vocations, new ventures. Maria encouraged them. Even when their departures left her lonelier, she understood that love does not cling, it releases. Her courage was not only in holding the family together, but also in letting it grow beyond her embrace. And still, the lodge remained her heart's center. Guests from around the world came to stay, drawn not only by the beauty of Vermont, but by the quiet legend of the family who had sung their way to freedom. Maria welcomed them with the warmth of a host who understood that hospitality was sacred. For her, every guest was not a stranger, but a pilgrim, seeking rest, renewal, or simply the echo of a story they had heard in song. In her later years, Maria became something of a symbol. People saw in her not just the woman from the famous story, but a figure of resilience. She had lived through empire and exile, through love and loss, through poverty and prosperity, and yet her eyes still carried brightness, her laughter still rang, her faith still guided her. Her life testified that courage is not the absence of fear but the persistence of hope. To the very end, Maria embodied the strength that had surprised even herself. She once entered the von Trapp household as a young novice, uncertain and shy. She left the world decades later as a matriarch whose voice had carried a family through exile, grief, and rebirth. Her courage was not heroic in the world's usual sense. It was deeper, quieter, woven into the very fabric of her days. And so, when people remembered the von Trapp family, they often thought of music, of mountains, of escape. But beneath those images lay the heartbeat of one woman's strength. Maria's courage, which turned loss into legacy, silence into song, and exile into home. Maria's strength became a beacon, not only for her family, but for all who came to know their story. Yet even as her laughter and resilience carried them forward, the world beyond their Vermont hills began to take notice. A world of cameras, stages, and stories that would soon shape their legacy in unexpected ways. Stories have a way of slipping beyond the lives that first gave them breath. What begins as memory, fragile and personal, can take on a second life when others begin to tell it. The von Trapp family, once a household of flesh and blood, discipline and laughter, soon became something larger, something luminous. A story retold so often that it shimmered into legend. It began quietly, as so much in their journey did. In Vermont, the family sang, worked, and welcomed guests to their lodge. Yet the world beyond those hills was curious. Who were these voices, these wanderers who had crossed oceans, fled tyranny, and built a new life through harmony? In 1949, Maria put pen to paper and gave the first answer. Her memoir, The Story of the Trapp Family Singers, was simple direct, and deeply human. It was not written to enchant, but to bear witness, to tell of Austria, of Georg, of children and song, of exile and homecoming. The book found an audience. Readers were moved not only by the facts of the family's escape, but by the spirit woven through Maria's words. There was courage in those pages, but also humor. There was loss, but also light. For many, the story was more than biography. It was balm, a reminder that faith and family could carry people through the storms of history. From the book came further retellings. First, a German film, then another in Austria. Titles shifted, details bent. Maria's straightforward account began to take on new shapes as playwrights and screenwriters adapted it for the stage. By the late 1950s, Broadway beckoned. In 1959, Rodgers and Hammerstein unveiled their musical, The Sound of Music. The curtain rose, and the story of the Von Trapps was no longer confined to paper or memory. It had become theatre, song, spectacle. The Broadway version took liberties. In place of exact history came characters molded for drama, timelines adjusted for tension, romance softened into melody. Audiences, however, did not mind. The show was a success, its songs quickly becoming classics. Climb Every Mountain, Do Re Mi, Edelweiss. These were not the family's original tunes, but they carried the spirit of their journey. In Broadway's lights, the Von Trapps became symbols, not just a family who fled tyranny, but a universal tale of hope and harmony. Then came the film. In 1965, Hollywood's retelling would reach millions. Julie Andrews as Maria, Christopher Plummer as the captain, Salzburg's landscapes glowing on the screen. The film was lush, romantic, sweeping. It carried audiences into alpine meadows, through abbey courtyards, across candlelit stages. And though it diverged even more from the true story, adding songs, rearranging events, simplifying struggles, it embedded itself deeply in global memory. For many, The Sound of Music was not merely a movie, it was an inheritance. Families watched it together, children learned its songs, tourists traveled to Salzburg to trace its footsteps. In villages far from Austria or Vermont, people hummed the melodies of Maria's fictionalized life. The Von Trapps, once wanderers in exile, had become part of the cultural imagination of the world. Yet with legend came distortion. The real Georg von Trapp was sterner, quieter, more wounded than the charming but aloof captain on screen. Maria's journey to love was slower, less instant than Hollywood suggested. Their escape had been by train, cautious and calculated, not across alpine peaks in the dark of night. The truth was subtler, less dramatic perhaps, but also more human. And so, the family often found themselves answering questions, gently correcting myths, smiling at the way their lives had been reshaped. Maria herself accepted the adaptations with a kind of amused surrender. She knew the difference between memory and myth, and she understood that stories have their own lives. It's not exact, she would say of the film, but it's true in spirit. What mattered most to her was not the precise detail of events, but the essence. A family that refused to bow, that carried faith and song across borders, that built a new life out of exile. The children, too, lived within this double existence. On one hand, they remembered the stern silence of their father, the warmth of their mother, the long train ride out of Salzburg. On the other, they saw themselves portrayed on stages and screens as characters with new names, new lines, new songs. They were both themselves and shadows of themselves, real and reimagined. It was a curious fate to live not only in one's own memory, but in the collective memory of millions. The film's release in the 1960s came at a particular moment. The world was still reeling from war, still struggling with tyranny in new forms, still searching for hope. Against that backdrop, the sound of music offered a vision of love stronger than fear, of family enduring beyond politics, of innocence standing firm against oppression. Whether or not the details matched history, the story nourished hearts wary of division. In Vermont, the Von Trapps continued their quieter life. The lodge welcomed guests, music still filled evenings, and Maria watched with a mixture of astonishment and gratitude as their story spread across continents. Visitors now came not only for the mountains, but for the legend. Some arrived humming the film's songs, eager to touch the edges of a story that had become myth. And Maria, practical and spirited as always, welcomed them, fed them, sang with them when the mood was right. There is something timeless in the way history turns to legend. Details may blur, facts may bend, but if the heart of the story remains, then something deeper is preserved. The Von Trapps' real escape was quieter, their struggles less romantic. Yet the heart of their tale, a refusal to surrender, a family bound by song, an insistence that freedom was worth exile, remained intact. That heart was what travelled, what crossed oceans of imagination, what found its way into living rooms and theatres around the world. And so the Von Trapps became more than themselves. They became archetype and melody, myth and memory. Children yet unborn would know them not by photographs or memoirs, but by Julie Andrews' voice ringing against a mountain sky, by a chorus of children singing their goodnight in harmony. The truth of their lives lay behind the curtain, quiet and human, but the legend carried forward radiant and untiring. Perhaps that is the fate of certain lives, to become larger than their own footprints, to echo beyond their own time. The Von Trapps did not set out to be myth. They set out only to survive, to sing, to remain free. Yet the world, hungry for hope, transformed their survival into a story, their song into a hymn. And in this transformation, something of them was preserved. Not the details, but the essence, the melody that underlay their every step. For those who visit the lodge in Vermont, the air is still thick with this paradox. You see the photographs, hear the stories, walk the rooms where they lived. And yet, in the back of your mind, the film's melodies play. Fiction and reality blur, intertwining like voices in harmony. The true Von Trapps lived, suffered, laughed, sang, and at the same time they lived again on screen, eternal, forever young, forever singing across the hills of Salzburg. In the end, perhaps the difference matters less than we think. The real Von Trapps endured exile, built a home, carried faith. The legendary Von Trapps sing forever on a mountaintop. Both truths hold weight. Both remind us of the same lesson, that courage can be gentle, that love can outlast fear, that song can be stronger than silence. The story retold may not be the story lived, but it carries the essence of it, like light refracted through glass, bending yet still shining true. And in that light, the Von Trapps remain, not only in Vermont, not only in history books, but in the imaginations of countless hearts, where melody becomes memory and memory becomes myth. And so their story, once whispered in exile, became a song sung across the world, reshaped, reframed, but never silenced. From myth to memory, from screen to song, the echo continued, flowing gently into the lives of children yet unborn, the next generation who would carry the family's voice forward. Voices are like rivers. They flow from one source, widening and branching, carrying with them the memory of where they began. The von Trapp family, once a household bound by silence, then reborn in song, discovered that their music was not only for their own time. It was a gift passed down, a current moving through children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, each new voice carrying echoes of the first. When Georg and Maria sang with their children, they could not have imagined how far the sound would travel. Their songs, once confined to the rooms of a house in Salzburg, carried across oceans, across decades, across lives not yet born. The family became more than a choir, they became a lineage of harmony. In Vermont, where the lodge stood firm against the winters, the younger von Trapps grew surrounded by music. For them, it was not performance alone, but daily rhythm. Songs sung in kitchens, in meadows, in quiet evenings when the fire glowed and stories were told. Their inheritance was not only notes and melodies, but the knowledge that music could heal, that it could resist silence, that it could speak when words faltered. The first generation carried the memories most vividly. They had walked the long corridors of their Salzburg home, heard the silence after Agathe's passing, felt the sternness of their father soften under Maria's teaching. They had sung in Salzburg's festival halls, boarded the train out of Austria, crossed seas and continents. For them, every song held a shadow of exile, every harmony a memory of freedom hard won. But as time stretched on, new generations entered the song without knowing exile firsthand. Grandchildren were born into American soil, speaking English before German, learning Austrian traditions as stories rather than lived memory. And yet, when they opened their mouths to sing, something deeper stirred. Listeners heard it a timbre, a resonance, a thread that tied them back to the family who had once fled in silence. It was as if music itself carried memory forward, binding generations together. The Trapp family singers officially disbanded in 1957, their years of touring complete. Yet the music did not fall silent. In the decades that followed, grandchildren formed new groups, carrying the repertoire of folk songs and sacred hymns into fresh audiences. In the 1990s, a new ensemble simply called the Von Trapp Children, 4 great-grandchildren of Georg and Maria, took to the stage. Their voices blended in youthful harmony, reminding listeners of the family's earliest years. They sang not to imitate, but to continue. Audiences marveled. Here were children born long after the flight from Austria, long after the war, long after the first performances in America. And yet, when they sang, it was as if the old story breathed again. Songs of their Austrian heritage mingled with American folk traditions, creating a bridge between past and present. People who had grown up watching the sound of music saw in these young performers not fiction, but continuity, proof that the family's voice had not been silenced by time. For the younger von Trapps, the music was not merely inheritance but discovery. Through song, they learned who they were. They learned that family was more than blood. It was harmony, discipline, resilience. They carried within them not only the melodies of their ancestors, but the courage that had once refused to yield to tyranny. Each performance became a small act of remembrance, a soft declaration that the story of freedom lived on. The echo did not end with performance. Many descendants found other ways to carry the family spirit forward. As teachers, writers, hosts at the Vermont Lodge, keepers of story, some chose quieter lives, far from the stage. But even there, the music lingered, a lullaby sung to a child, a hymn whispered at bedtime, a Christmas carol shared around the table. These small, unseen moments carried the same inheritance. The voice of the family did not require fame to remain alive. It required only love. Visitors to the lodge in Vermont often felt the presence of this echo. Walking through its halls, they could sense that the walls had absorbed generations of song. Photographs of the early family hung beside more recent portraits, creating a gallery of continuity. Guests might hear a member of the younger generations playing the piano in a corner room, or catch a group of cousins laughing as they sang a familiar folk tune. The music was not staged, it was lived, as natural as breath. There is something moving about the way music weaves through lineage. It is not like property, passed with legal titles. It is not like wealth, stored and divided. It is more fragile and yet more enduring. It is carried in memory, in muscle, in breath. It can falter, but it can also rise again in a single voice. The Von Trapps discovered that their greatest inheritance was not a lodge, nor a film, nor even a legend. It was the simple ability to gather and sing, to create harmony in a fractured world. As generations grew and spread, some remaining in Vermont, others traveling the world, the echo only widened. The family became both local and global, rooted in a hillside lodge, yet resonant in countless homes, where the sound of music played, where Maria's memoir was read, where a child learned Edelweiss on a piano. Even those who bore no blood relation to the family became, in a sense, their inheritors. For music, once released, does not belong only to those who sing it, it belongs to those who hear it, remember it, and pass it on. In this way, the Von Trapps' voice became communal. Teachers taught their songs in classrooms, choirs adapted their repertoire, families sang their melodies around tables at Christmas. Strangers became carriers of the echo, and so the line between family and world blurred until the Von Trapps' legacy was not only genetic but cultural, not only private but shared. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, each added a note, a variation, a new instrument. Some continued in music, others pursued different paths. Yet the core remained a voice that would not fade. What began as the discipline of a naval officer and the gentle laughter of his wife had become a living chorus, spanning continents, centuries, and countless lives touched by their song. In this, there is a lesson. History does not always endure through monuments of stone or lines in books. Sometimes it endures in breath, in melody, in the fragile continuity of song passed from one generation to the next. The Von Trapps remind us that even when exile scatters a family, even when tyranny drives them across borders, the voice can endure, reshaping itself, softening, strengthening, but never vanishing. And so, as the years advance, the echoes continue. A lullaby in Vermont, a concert in Oregon, a hymn sung in a distant chapel, a melody remembered in Salzburg by tourists who hum it under their breath. The song is everywhere and nowhere, rooted in history yet alive in the present. The Von Trapps' voice has become like wind, unseen but felt. Across time, the Von Trapps' voices drift like echoes through generations, a song that refuses to fade, reshaped but enduring. And as their descendants carry the music forward, we turn now to the last note of their journey. Not only inheritance, but the enduring melody of freedom itself. There are stories that unfold like battles filled with armies, weapons, and fire. And then there are stories that unfold like songs, quiet at first, rising and falling, carrying with them truths too deep for words alone. The story of the Von Trapps is the latter. It begins with silence, it grows into harmony, and it ends with an echo that stretches far beyond the lives of those who first sang. It is a reminder that freedom, at times, comes not from might but from melody, not from swords, but from voices raised together. When we trace their journey from the stone walls of Salzburg to the wooded hills of Vermont, it feels almost like following a single piece of music. There is an overture, quiet and restrained, as Georg's house stood wrapped in discipline and loss. There is a crescendo, as Maria entered with laughter, teaching children to sing where silence had ruled. There is tension, a darker theme, as tyranny rose across Austria, threatening to claim their home. And then, a daring escape, a movement of flight, carrying them across borders and seas. Finally, there is a resolution, soft and steady, as their voices found a new home, singing to audiences who listened not just for notes, but for what those notes meant. Their music was never simply entertainment, it was testimony. Each note carried memory, each harmony carried defiance. To sing Austrian folk songs in America was to remember a home left behind but never forgotten. To sing hymns was to root themselves in faith even when the future was uncertain. To sing together as a family was to remind the world that bonds of love and loyalty could withstand exile, poverty, and fear. And so their concerts became more than performances. They became acts of remembrance, rituals of belonging, even weapons against despair. In the 1940s, when war raged and millions faced loss, audiences found in the Von Trapps a glimpse of resilience. Their harmonies said what words could not. That beauty could survive brutality, that voices could rise even when nations fell. The family themselves understood this. Maria, who had once taught children to sing in a quiet villa, now stood on stage before strangers, offering music as bread for weary souls. Georg, who had once commanded silence in his household, now let his children's voices ring freely, proud not of their discipline alone, but of their courage. For him, music had become something larger than art. It was freedom made audible. As the years passed and the family aged, the notes changed. Children grew into adults, voices deepened, harmonies shifted. The Trapp family singers eventually disbanded, their years of touring behind them. Yet even in their final concerts, one could hear it, the sound of survival. Their last bows were not endings, but offerings, a passing of the song into the hands of others. And indeed, the song did not end. The next generations took it up, reshaping it, singing anew. The story of the Von Trapps had already leapt into legend, carried by memoirs and films. But it continued also in quieter ways. A grandchild humming a lullaby, a gathering around Christmas where old folk songs returned, a descendant joining others on stage, not to replicate the past, but to honor it. The music endured not because it was preserved in recordings, but because it remained alive in breath when we listen to their story now, decades later. What strikes us most is not the glamour of their fame, nor the romance of their escape, but the simplicity of their truth, that freedom can be sung. Theirs was a freedom not won by violence, but by choosing to walk away, to refuse compromise with tyranny, to place love above fear. They had little wealth, no armies, no weapons. But they had their voices, and they had each other. That was enough. In this, their journey speaks to something universal. Many families flee oppression. Many leave behind homes they love. Many find themselves in new lands, struggling to begin again. What makes the Von Trapp's story distinct is not only their courage, but their insistence on carrying music with them. They refused to let exile silence them. Instead, they turned it into harmony. And in doing so, they offered the world not only their own survival, but a map for the heart. A way of remembering, a way of resisting, a way of healing. Consider the power of a song. It enters the ear, but it does not stop there. It stirs the memory, awakens emotion, ties past and present together. A single note can carry centuries, a single melody can call forth entire homelands. For refugees, for exiles, for wanderers, music becomes more than art. It becomes home itself, portable, indestructible, alive wherever it is sung. For the Von Trapps, this was their greatest treasure, that even as Austria faded behind them, Austria lived on in their music. The world has not forgotten them. Partly because of the film that immortalized their story, partly because of their concerts, but mostly because of the way their music resonated. People sensed that behind the harmonies lay something real. A family that had risked everything for freedom and then offered their voices as a gift. To this day, when audiences hear Edelweiss or The Lonely Goatherd or Ave Maria, they hear more than melody. They hear memory, they hear exile, they hear hope, and perhaps that is why their story continues to inspire. In times of fear, we look for courage. In times of division, we look for harmony. In times of exile, we look for belonging. The Von Trapps remind us that courage need not roar. Sometimes it can sing. Harmony need not only be musical, it can also be the harmony of lives lived in fidelity to one another. Belonging need not mean staying in one land. It can mean carrying home within us, wherever we go. As their descendants continue to sing, as their story continues to be told, one truth becomes clear. Freedom's last note is never the last. It lingers, it echoes, it carries into new voices, new lands, new hearts. It is a note that cannot be silenced because it does not belong to one family alone. It belongs to all who choose love over fear, courage over compromise, harmony over silence. And so, tonight, as we reflect on their story, we might imagine it not as a finished tale, but as a song still unfolding. Somewhere, a child sings a lullaby taught by a grandparent who once knew the Von Trapp's music. Somewhere, a choir rehearses a folk song from Austria, not knowing that it once gave courage to a family in exile. Somewhere, a listener hums along to a melody from The Sound of Music, unaware that it was once sung on stages across America by refugees who had fled tyranny. The Von Trapps remind us, history is not only written, sometimes it is sung, and when it is sung, it cannot easily be silenced. The tyrants who once tried to command silence are gone. Their voices have faded, but the song remains. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom of all, that the final word does not belong to fear, but to harmony. That the last note does not belong to oppression, but to love. That the music, carried forward, is always stronger than the silence left behind. The Von Trapp's story is a lullaby for the world, soft, courageous, enduring. A lullaby that reminds us that freedom may begin in defiance, but it lasts in song. The Von Trapp's melody lingers, like a note held beyond its measure, carrying into generations yet to come. And as their voices fade into memory, we are left with a question: what songs of freedom will we choose to carry forward into tomorrow? And so, the voices of the Von Trapp family drift now into silence, but not into forgetting. Like echoes folded into the hush of the mountains, their song still lingers. A reminder that even in the darkest hours, light can be carried in the fragile vessel of a melody. What we have shared tonight is more than history. It is a gentle truth that courage need not shout, that love can be its own form of resistance, and that harmony, when sung together, can carry a family, and perhaps the world, through the storm. And so the candle of their story burns quietly in time, its flame passed from generation to generation, never dimmed, only softened. Thank you, dear listener, for keeping me company in this quiet space tonight. It means more than you know to imagine you out there, wherever you are, letting these words settle over you like a quilt. In listening, you become part of this timeless chain, a keeper of memory, a witness to echoes that still hum in the quiet. Now, there is nothing left to do. Let the day slip gently from your shoulders. Let your body grow heavy, your breath slow, your thoughts light. May your dreams carry you kindly through fields of peace and rivers of stillness. May you sleep well beneath the hush of history's lullaby. This has been the Sleeping Hourglass, a place where the past tucks you in, and where each story is a lantern in the night. If tonight brought you peace, know that you are always welcome to return, to rest again in the soft corridors of time. For now, good night, and may the silence after the song guide you tenderly into sleep.